This is not how trade dominance collapses. Most people think this is about lumber prices. Canada and China signing agreements for timber exports and forest product supply chains. Technical specifications for wood processing facilities and shipping logistics. The kind of trade arrangement that fills industry publications and gets analyzed by commodity market specialists. But when Canada commits $15 billion to redirecting its lumber exports away from American markets toward China, that is not routine trade diversification. That is the systematic elimination of American control over the resource that built every suburb, every housing development, every construction project that made the American dream economically accessible. For 80 years, Canadian lumber flowed south. Softwood timber from British Columbia forests processed in American mills. Douglas fir and hemlock from Canadian forests framed American houses. The infrastructure existed, the trade relationships were established. The profits supported both economies, and everyone understood that North American lumber was essentially integrated under American market coordination. Trump destroyed that arrangement in 36 months. Not through military action or diplomatic pressure, but by treating Canadian natural resources like American strategic assets, where Canadian export decisions were subordinate to American market interests. First, with softwood lumber tariffs reaching 30% on Canadian exports, then with threats to restrict Canadian resource access to American markets unless Canada prioritized American housing needs over global trade opportunities. Then with explicit demands that Canada limit exports to countries America considered strategic competitors. He assumed resource dependence meant permanent subordination, that American market size gave Washington permanent leverage over Canadian export decisions, that geography made alternatives economically impossible. Instead, he gave Canada the strategic justification to do what global trade had always made possible: build resource export relationships that make American market access optional rather than mandatory. Mark Carney announced the Canada-China Comprehensive Lumber Partnership in Vancouver, February 14, 2026. Not in Washington, where trade protocols would require American consultation. Not through USMCA channels, where American lumber interests could demand coordination oversight. In British Columbia, standing next to Chinese Commerce Minister Wang Wentao, speaking directly to an audience that included executives from every major Canadian forestry company and representatives from China's construction and manufacturing industries. The commitment was unprecedented. 15 billion Canadian dollars over 8 years, matched by 12 billion yuan from China. Combined investment approaching $30 billion specifically for timber processing infrastructure, shipping capacity, and forest management systems that would operate independently of American lumber market coordination while providing comprehensive wood product supply that exceeds anything individual North American markets can absorb. This is not theoretical trade development. This is the construction of parallel lumber supply chains designed to make American housing market dependence on Canadian wood irrelevant within a decade. Lumber represents the foundation of American residential construction and housing affordability. Traditional home building depends on Canadian softwood because American forests cannot provide sufficient quality timber at competitive prices. Canadian lumber provides the structural integrity for 70% of American residential construction. Without Canadian wood, American housing costs increase dramatically, construction timelines extend, and homeownership becomes economically inaccessible for middle-class families. The entity that controls Canadian lumber exports controls the economic accessibility of American home ownership. Every house frame, every construction project, every housing development becomes either affordable or expensive depending on who controls the wood supply that makes residential construction economically viable. For decades, the United States maintained commanding leverage over Canadian lumber through market size and trade agreements. American construction companies purchased Canadian timber through established supply chains. American homebuilders designed projects around Canadian wood specifications. American lumber distributors coordinated Canadian imports to meet American construction demands. That control is ending through Canadian coordination that excludes American market participation. The Canada-China partnership brings together complementary lumber capabilities that collectively exceed American market capacity. Canada contributes world-class forest resources through sustainable logging operations in British Columbia, Alberta, and Ontario. Canadian forestry companies provide advanced timber processing technology and forest management expertise. Canadian lumber quality standards meet or exceed any global construction requirements. China contributes massive construction demand through urbanization projects, requiring millions of tons of timber annually. Chinese manufacturing capabilities provide value-added wood processing that creates finished products rather than raw material exports. Chinese shipping infrastructure enables direct lumber transport between Canadian ports and Chinese construction sites without American intermediaries. Combined, Canada and China can create complete lumber supply chains without depending on American market demand, American processing facilities, or American distribution networks. Every aspect of timber production, from forest management to finished construction materials, can be completed through Canadian-Chinese cooperation. The strategic implications are transformative. Canadian lumber exported to China bypasses American markets entirely. Wood products that previously supported American construction now supply Chinese development projects. Timber resources that kept American housing affordable now serve Chinese urbanization rather than American homeownership. For the first time since North American trade integration, Canadian natural resources will flow to markets that operate completely independently of American economic coordination. The partnership established 4 parallel development tracks that will fundamentally alter global lumber markets within 6 years. First, integrated timber processing and manufacturing systems. Raw lumber export provides limited economic value compared to finished wood products that command premium prices in global markets. Canada and China are developing combined processing facilities that convert Canadian timber into finished construction materials, furniture components, and specialty wood products for Chinese domestic consumption and global export. These facilities will include advanced sawmills, engineered wood production, and value-added manufacturing that transforms Canadian trees into high-value products. The processing systems will create Canadian jobs in forest communities while providing Chinese markets with finished wood products that previously required multiple international suppliers. Canadian lumber becomes Chinese construction materials without touching American supply chains. Second, sustainable forest management and expansion programs. Meeting Chinese lumber demand requires forest operations that can provide consistent timber supply for decades while maintaining environmental sustainability. The partnership includes Canadian forest expansion and management programs funded through Chinese investment. These programs will increase sustainable timber harvesting capacity, implement advanced reforestation techniques, and develop new forest areas specifically for export markets. Forest management will operate according to Canadian environmental standards while serving Chinese market demand. Sustainable logging practices ensure long-term timber supply without compromising forest ecology or Canadian environmental commitments. Third, direct shipping and logistics infrastructure. Lumber transport traditionally required American intermediaries and distribution networks that added costs and delays to Canadian exports. Canada and China are building direct shipping routes between Canadian lumber ports and Chinese construction centers. These shipping networks will include specialized timber vessels, port facilities designed for lumber handling, and logistics coordination that eliminates American transportation involvement. Direct shipping reduces lumber costs while providing more reliable delivery schedules. Chinese construction projects receive Canadian timber through supply chains that operate independently of American logistics networks. Fourth, comprehensive trade financing and payment systems. Lumber trade traditionally required American financial institutions and dollar-denominated transactions that gave American banks influence over Canadian export decisions. The partnership includes Chinese yuan financing for Canadian forestry operations and bilateral payment systems that conduct lumber trade without American financial intermediation. Chinese banks provide project funding, while Canadian forestry companies receive payments through banking networks that exclude American oversight. Financial independence enables trade decisions based on commercial considerations rather than American political pressures. Canadian lumber companies can serve Chinese markets without requiring American financial approval or currency conversion. The economic implications are staggering. American residential construction consumes approximately $40 billion in Canadian lumber annually. Every Canadian timber export to China represents wood that American homebuilders can no longer purchase at previous prices and availability levels. Canadian lumber redirected to Chinese markets creates immediate supply shortages for American construction. Reduced timber availability increases lumber prices across American markets. Higher wood costs translate directly into higher housing costs for American consumers. American construction companies built their business models on reliable access to Canadian lumber at competitive prices. When Canada prioritizes Chinese markets, American builders lose their primary source of affordable timber. Construction costs increase, project timelines extend, and housing development becomes less profitable. The timeline is aggressive and achievable. First processing facilities begin operations in 2027. Major shipping infrastructure completes by 2028. Full lumber supply chains operate independently by 2030. Complete market redirection achieves target volumes by 2032. Within 6 years, China will receive Canadian lumber volumes that previously supplied American construction markets, creating permanent supply constraints for American residential development. American lumber industry capabilities remain significant but increasingly inadequate for domestic construction needs. The United States maintains forest resources and processing facilities, but domestic production cannot replace Canadian lumber volumes at comparable prices and quality levels. American forest management assumed that Canadian lumber would always supplement domestic timber production. When Canadian wood flows to Chinese markets instead of American construction sites, domestic forests cannot fill the supply gap without dramatic price increases and quality compromises. American lumber companies can increase domestic production, but they cannot force Canadian exporters to prioritize American markets when Chinese markets offer superior pricing and more reliable long-term contracts. Resource control without market competitiveness is economic irrelevance disguised as industry capability. The partnership is attracting additional suppliers from countries that want lumber market access without American trade restrictions. Russia is contributing Siberian timber through Chinese coordination. Brazil is providing tropical hardwoods for specialty construction applications. Norway is offering sustainable forest products through the same supply chains. Each new supplier brings timber resources that strengthen Chinese construction supply while reducing dependence on any single lumber source. What began as Canadian-Chinese cooperation is becoming multilateral forestry development that collectively provides more comprehensive wood products than American markets alone can offer. For American homebuilders, the implications are economic catastrophe. Residential construction depends on affordable lumber that maintains predictable availability and competitive pricing. When Canadian timber serves Chinese markets preferentially, American construction faces supply constraints that make housing development economically unfeasible. The American construction industry built its expansion on Canadian lumber that provided quality timber at prices that made homeownership accessible to middle-class families. When lumber costs increase by 30 to 50% due to supply constraints, residential construction becomes profitable only for luxury housing markets. Housing affordability depends on construction costs that include lumber as the primary expense variable. When Canadian wood flows to Chinese markets, American construction costs increase systematically, making homeownership unaffordable for families that previously qualified for mortgages. The transformation is already beginning. Major Canadian forestry companies are redirecting export capacity toward Chinese markets that offer long-term contracts and premium pricing. American lumber distributors are reporting supply constraints and price increases that reflect reduced Canadian availability. Construction companies are delaying projects while seeking alternative timber sources that cost significantly more than traditional Canadian supplies. American housing markets can still access lumber, but they cannot control supply decisions that favor Chinese markets over American construction needs. Every Canadian timber shipment to China represents construction materials that American builders no longer access at competitive prices. The psychological impact on American construction industry leadership is evident in congressional testimony where lumber executives describe supply challenges they cannot address through domestic production increases. House construction. Subcommittee members receiving briefings on Canadian lumber diversification that clearly represent threats to American housing affordability, but offer no policy responses that would not damage broader trade relationships. Housing industry personnel acknowledge privately that American residential construction advantages depend on Canadian lumber access that increasingly prioritizes foreign markets over American construction needs. Commerce Department officials recognize that housing affordability erodes when Canadian timber operates beyond American market influence. The federal bureaucracy is responding with domestic forest management increases, but expanded logging cannot solve the fundamental problem. American housing affordability was built on Canadian lumber advantages that provided quality timber at competitive prices. Canada is redirecting those advantages through Chinese partnership that offers superior market conditions. International construction markets are watching Canadian-Chinese lumber cooperation with interest rather than concern. European builders are exploring timber partnerships with both countries. Japanese construction companies are developing wood supply agreements that could integrate with Canadian-Chinese networks. Australian forestry operations are considering lumber cooperation agreements that would provide diversified export markets. International construction markets recognize that Canadian timber offers quality advantages that traditional suppliers cannot match. Participating in Canadian-Chinese lumber development provides superior construction materials without requiring dependence on American market coordination. Global construction industries are not opposing American interests deliberately, but they are prioritizing their own material requirements over American housing market stability. When those priorities conflict, international builders are choosing Canadian lumber efficiency over American construction coordination. The precedent matters beyond lumber markets. If major resource suppliers can successfully redirect exports away from American markets toward more attractive alternatives, other areas of supposed American trade dominance become questionable. Agricultural products that bypass American distribution networks, energy resources that serve international markets independently of American coordination, critical minerals that supply global manufacturing without American intermediation. Each area where suppliers achieve market independence reduces American trade leverage and influence. The Canada-China Comprehensive Lumber Partnership is the first comprehensive demonstration that major resource suppliers can redirect traditional American trade relationships toward more profitable alternatives, while excluding American market participation entirely. Success encourages additional trade independence projects that further reduce American market advantages. 20 years ago, American market dominance seemed insurmountable. American consumers provided the largest demand for Canadian resources. American companies coordinated North American trade flows. American market coordination ensured that Canadian exports depended on American economic leadership. The lumber partnership breaks that pattern completely. Canada is redirecting timber exports toward Chinese markets that provide superior commercial terms while excluding American trade coordination entirely. Trump wanted to demonstrate that Canadian resources needed American market access for economic viability. Instead, he motivated Canada to develop lumber export relationships that make American market participation optional rather than essential. By the time Washington acknowledges the shift, Canadian lumber will already supply Chinese construction projects that previously would have served American housing markets. Timber resources will already operate beyond American trade oversight. Canadian export decisions will already function independently of American market coordination. History does not reverse because it is misunderstood. Trade dominance is shifting from American control toward bilateral resource relationships that exclude American market intermediation. Lumber exports are restructuring around Canadian-Chinese supply chains that operate beyond traditional American trade oversight. Resource control is distributing among suppliers who choose market cooperation over trade subordination and discover they can achieve more together than under American coordination. They can no longer trust to prioritize supplier interests over American consumer demands. The American dream was built on Canadian lumber that made home ownership affordable. That lumber is now building Chinese cities, while American housing costs spiral beyond middle-class reach. Trump threatened Canadian trade. He got Chinese construction supplied by Canadian forests, while American families can no longer afford the houses that Canadian timber once made economically accessible.